Tonight, picture this. Under the vast, quiet skies of Kansas and North Dakota, towering grain silos stand full, overflowing even. Yet the rail lines beside them lie still. No rumble of freight cars, no trucks rushing off to distant ports. Just farmers staring into the distance, anxious, wondering who'll buy their wheat next. Because something huge is shifting. From the bustling bakeries of Manila to the pasta lines of Naples, from the baguette counters of Marseille to ramen factories in Seoul. Countries that once counted on American wheat without a second thought are quietly turning away. Not because of price. In fact, U.S. wheat often costs less. But in a tense, unpredictable world, trust is proving more valuable than a discount. And right now, that trust is eroding. One contract, one shipment, one silent decision at a time. So how did America, once the breadbasket the world depended on, start losing ground to Canada and Australia? What triggered this steady, almost invisible migration of buyers? And why does it matter far beyond wheat? Join me inside the video, where we'll break down exactly how this all unfolded, and what it means for the future of global trade and American influence. Let's dive in. Not long ago, U.S. wheat was practically the world's security blanket. In Parisian bakeries, Manila grocery chains, Korean noodle factories, American grain wasn't simply a commodity. It was a dependable pillar of daily life. For the U.S., wheat exports also served as subtle instruments of influence. They forged bonds of interdependence. Nations that relied on steady U.S. shipments also found themselves entangled in broader American standards and geopolitical preferences. It was a kind of soft power too pervasive to be obvious, until it began to vanish. By mid-2025, that quiet strength was crumbling. Surprisingly, not because others beat the U.S. on price. In many places, American wheat still ran $8 to $10 per ton cheaper. The real problem was credibility. In a world rattled by pandemic scars, war in Ukraine, and climate volatility, buyers found they valued predictability over bargains. The Philippines, a sharp sudden break. Few markets illustrated this shift more starkly than the Philippines. For decades, Manila was a near-guaranteed buyer, taking around 3 million tons annually, overwhelmingly from the United States. If there was one customer American farmers counted on, it was them. But in May 2025, that trust ruptured overnight. A leading Philippine miller abruptly canceled a 12,000-ton order from the U.S. and, without hesitating, inked a much larger deal, 110,000 tons, with Canada and Australia. Their internal documents spelled it out. American wheat was becoming politically risky. Export protocols changed unpredictably. Insurance premiums soared to cover the chance of sanctions or regulatory hiccups. In Manila's tightly contested consumer markets, such risks were intolerable. So Philippine bakeries kept turning out bread, only now it was baked with Canadian and Australian grain. No outcry, no drama, just a quiet, permanent pivot. France. Trust eclipses tradition. Then came France, where bread isn't just sustenance, but a cultural emblem. For decades, America's hard red wheat defined the texture and flavor of baguettes and croissants. But by late 2025, imports from the U.S. had plunged to their lowest point in over 20 years. French buyers pointed to missed quality marks, delayed shipments, carbon scores breaching strict EU thresholds, and chemical residues out of sync with tightening regulations. But beyond the spreadsheets, they confessed a simpler fear. No one knew if a single U.S. political vote might snarl the next cargo at customs. Meanwhile, Canada was executing a masterclass in supply chain diplomacy. Automated certifications, exact protein guarantees, seamless compliance with Brussels climate and chemical standards. Even if Canadian wheat cost a bit more, it was a safer bet. So across Marseille and Lyon, bakers kept their routines unchanged. Only the wheat now traced back to Saskatchewan instead of Kansas. The shift happened almost invisibly. South Korea, the glyphosate wake-up. South Korea's rupture might be the most jarring. For nearly 4 decades, Korean companies like Nongshim and Orion relied on American wheat for everything from instant ramen to bakery snacks. It was one of the world's least politicized agri-chains. By mid-2025, though, America's market share collapsed from above 35% to under 17%, while Canada surged past 60%. Why? A quiet rule change. Korea tightened glyphosate residue standards. American wheat regularly showed 200 to 400 parts per billion, levels suddenly too high. Canadian and Australian samples hovered between 30 to 70. For Korean importers, that delta wasn't just a lab statistic. It was the difference between smooth customs clearance and expensive retesting or rejection. Within months, U.S. wheat vanished from Busan's warehouses, replaced by Canadian stock that arrived pre-certified and blockchain-tracked. Mexico, neighbors now hesitant. Perhaps the most painful defection was Mexico. For decades, it ranked among America's top 3 wheat buyers. By 2025, imports from the U.S. had plummeted by almost 40%, while Canada's share soared and Argentina began nibbling at the pie. Here the culprit wasn't pesticides, it was bureaucratic volatility. Mexican millers were exhausted by surprise paperwork changes out of Washington, abrupt tariff recalculations, new certificate demands, shifting health declarations. A single holdup at the Texas border once forced Sonora bakeries to pay extra storage fees and drove up local bread prices. So they pivoted north, not to U.S. silos just across the border, but to Canada. For Mexican buyers, a stable contract mattered more than shaving a few dollars off a ton. Italy, pasta's quiet divorce. And then there's Italy, the spiritual home of durum wheat. By tradition, it was a stalwart buyer of U.S. high-gluten grain. By 2025, that tradition was crumbling. Canadian scientists had invested in new durum varieties that nailed Italy's exacting specs: elasticity, color, climate-linked carbon marks. So, Italian pasta plants now turn mostly to Saskatchewan, not North Dakota. No trade war, no nationalist campaign, simply a silent migration toward a partner who understood that quality isn't just the kernel itself, but also the paper trail, the carbon ledger, the assurance that a single diplomatic spat wouldn't derail an entire shipload. A bigger lens, political capital quietly lost. Looking at these shifts as an economist, what worries me most isn't the revenue loss, though that stings plenty. It's the erosion of America's soft power architecture. For generations, nations structured entire food ecosystems around U.S. reliability. That bound them into broader American norms, from intellectual property enforcement to defense collaborations. Wheat was an invisible glue in a sprawling system of global influence. As countries now rebuild those systems around Canada and Australia, they're also drifting from that quiet U.S.-anchored order. Mexican trade envoys increasingly coordinate with Ottawa. Philippine AG ministers fly more often to Toronto than to D.C. That may seem minor, but over decades, it resets who writes the rules. It was never about the cheapest bushel. Here's the deeper truth. This pivot wasn't about undercutting American farmers on price. Across nearly every case, Manila, Marseille, Busan, Naples, U.S. wheat remained the cheaper option. The real penalty lay in soft costs, extra insurance, compliance headaches, fear that next week's policy pivot might trap a shipment. In today's jittery global economy, predictability is worth more than a discount. As a European mill director told me bluntly last month, the U.S. gives us a cheaper invoice on Tuesday, then maybe changes the documentation on Wednesday. Canada just delivers on Thursday. No surprises. Could the U.S. turn it around? Yes, but only if it truly absorbs the lesson. America needs to recognize that in global trade, stability is currency. It must streamline export paperwork, stabilize regulatory signals, and integrate the kind of farm-to-port digital monitoring Canada pioneered. That's how to restore confidence, load by load, season by season, until buyers stop bracing for the next bureaucratic shock. Until American wheat isn't just good, but reliably good. The broader warning, this isn't just wheat. What's happening in these fields is almost certainly a harbinger for other sectors. If the U.S. doesn't fix trust in its agri-exports, the same erosion will creep into soybeans, beef, even advanced manufacturing. Global buyers are watching how America handles its grains and drawing conclusions about its tech, its pharmaceuticals, even its financial systems. Because ultimately, trade is about trust. Lose that, and you don't just lose sales. You lose influence, norms, entire alliances built quietly over decades. So tonight, under the wide skies of Nebraska and the Dakotas, farmers watch their bins overflow, waiting for trains that don't come. Some pivot to flax or barley, a few torch unsellable fields. It's heartbreak, yes, but also a message. If the U.S. wants to remain the backbone of global food, and by extension a cornerstone of global stability, it must move beyond slogans. Trust is rebuilt slowly, contract by contract, harvest by harvest. And that might just be the most critical export challenge of the next decade.